Little Gideon is quite an underrated character in Gravity Falls, and in fact, looking at Little Gideon's character more closely allows one to really think about what Gravity Falls does right and what it does better than a lot of other animated shows. How it takes this relatively one note and rather fatuous character and imbues him with not depth necessarily, but certainly more fleshing out. A greater attention to character detail, a greater attention to gradually making him more and more of an actual character, and even having him fill a rather significant role in the show as a kind of foil. I have not really seen this talked about a lot, which is one reason why I'm making this video, but Gideon is a foil to Mabel. His faults are very similar to her faults. The difference being that he takes his errors much further and refuses to learn from his mistakes in the same way that Mabel somewhat does. Gideon has this overinflated sense of himself, this rather arrogant willfulness, this lack of concern for the opinions of others, this deep desire to view his own desires as not just being foremost and not just being vital, but enough to create real change in the world by themselves in order to shape the world to his whims. This is a cardinal fault in this show, which is about a sense of mystery and a sense of uncertainty. It's not a show that discourages the pursuit of knowledge, necessarily, but it is a show that emphasizes human limitations and deeply discourages the pursuit of knowledge for selfish and self-aggrandizing ends, trying to reshape the world to one's own whims, trying to take power and use power simply for petty and selfish reasons, not necessarily out of this grand megalomania, although Gideon does trend toward that, but out of this desire to have the world be how one wants it to be. To ignore that sense of limitation. What Gideon hates the most in the world is he would probably say those who defy him, who don't listen to him, who don't obey him. But beyond that, it is this necessity to realize his own limitations, this necessity to realize that the world is how it is, and he cannot simply shape it to his will by whining and complaining and coming up with all these clever schemes to freeze the world as he would have it. This is a fault that the show is very much against. Even a relatively sympathetic character like Ford is guilty of that. He prizes his own intellect a bit too much. He is a bit too overly concerned with his quest for knowledge and greater understanding and the perception of himself as this brilliant, considerate, dazzling man of science who will make real advances in the world. Bill ultimately defeats him by playing to that ego. Bill, this Luciferian character, this emblem of endless dark power, finds human pretensions laughable because he knows how paltry and empty they are compared to his power. And the show does not agree with Bill wholly, but it does fundamentally share his disdain of human egotism. The only way that they're able to defeat Bill at the end is with selflessness, with a sense of sacrifice, by working together toward a common end, not with this self-aggrandizing egotism that grasps even a genuinely smart person like Ford. And Dipper is guilty of this to an extent. But it is a common fault throughout the show, and it manifests in different ways. And the way it manifests in Gideon is very similar to the way it manifests in Mabel. Mabel, fundamentally, is naively optimistic about the world, but deeply passionate about trying to shape the world to be how she wants it to be. This is a much kinder version of trying to enforce one's childish will on an uncertain and unknowable world than what we see in Gideon, but it's a spectrum. If Gideon is at the worst end of the spectrum, Mabel is kind of in the middle-ish. But they're both manifestations of the same kinds of tendencies. Mabel comes into the show with these abstract plans, like, okay, I want to get a boyfriend, so I will go and ask every guy I see, more or less, if he wants to be my boyfriend, and that'll work. It is a plan that prizes, number one, her own willpower and her own determination, and number two, her own likability, her own whimsicalness. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work for a number of reasons. Some people actually do end up liking her, like the mermaid man, the merman, Mermando. While a lot of her attempts are much less dignified than that. And Mabel, though, has a much stronger desire even than that, and that is a desire to hang on to childhood, to keep things the way they are now. Because Mabel fundamentally likes the status quo. She has her unfulfilled yearnings, but fundamentally she likes the summer. She likes how things are. And as critical as we can be of Mabel, as viewers of the show, we are fundamentally allied with her simply by the structure of the work. We also do not want summer to end, because when summer is over, the show is over, and we do not want the show to be over. It's an interesting structural thing that the show does quite well. Mabel is for the eternal now, for the constant present. And sometimes she is right, and the show agrees with her quite often, like when she wants Dipper to keep celebrating Summerween and not move on to more adolescent ways of celebrating the holiday, like going to parties. Instead, she wants him to still go trick-or-treating with her. Still have that sweet bond they've had since childhood. That is what she treasures foremost. Even her flirtations with boys are very much in this childish register, and that's fine with her. She's not like Dipper, who fundamentally uses his flirtations with people like Wendy in order to try to be more mature, try to reach toward adulthood. It is not like that for Mabel, and all this fundamentally comes to a head in Dipper and Mabel versus the Future, arguably the most important episode of the show, wherein Mabel is so discontent, so inconsolable about summer ending that she is more or less willing to do anything to stop it from ending, to keep the status quo going. and thus remain close with her dearly beloved brother, leading to the tragedies at the ending of the show. Gideon is a worse version of that. He wants Mabel, and so he tries to get her. And he's creepy and weird, and he's this clear parody of an 80s, 90s style evangelical southern preacher, but at the same time, he's a small child, and it's weird. This is a character that could be very easily just treated as a one-dimensional stereotype, but he desires to see the world in his image. This is best emblematized at the end of season 1 when he builds this enormous giant robot to fulfill his desires. He wants everything to be his. He wants everything to be like he desires it to be. And that includes overcoming the wills of others, such as when he takes the deed of the Mystery Shack through some rather convoluted plans that admittedly the show is a bit sketchy about, and desires to evict everyone and only have his will be present. And because he is this kind of person, he is fundamentally unable to deal with the fundamental powerlessness of himself on a grand cosmic scale. The superseding of him by Bill as the main villain of the show emblematizes this. Gideon, for all his cleverness and all his ability to convince people initially that he's a psychic, is just this rather silly, arrogant child. Bill is this all-powerful creature of pure evil. Gideon, though he tries to invoke Bill's help, ultimately is shunted to the side. He's ultimately downgraded to being simply a minor villain. He is forced to understand his own powerlessness, and he does not know how to do this. Jean-Paul Sartre talks very well about the deep melancholy and existential malaise that overcomes us when we understand that our self-identity is not simply something that we project to the world. It is something that is made in the world, that is made in conjunction with the opinions and experiences of others. We can think of ourselves as being all noble and brave and courageous, but if others do not see us in that way, in fact, if they see us in the exact opposite way, then our perceptions of ourselves have no basis in reality. They are empty and vacuous, these simple projections of an idealized image into an uncertain world. Self-identity is inevitably tenuous and impermanent for Sartre. And so this causes deep existential confusion and suffering. And something similar happens for Gideon, something similar happens for Mabel. Mabel is a bit more graceful about it, and she does grow up a bit over the course of the show, and especially at the end of the Mabel's Bubble episode, she rejects this idealized world created simply out of her head, out of her projections, and accepts that she has to live in the actual world that she cannot shape to her whims. That identity is identity in the world, that being is being with others, that a perception of the self and a perception of desire that is completely contrasted with the actual realities on the ground is disembodied and vacuous. And she accepts reality in all of its messy complexity. Gideon does too, to a somewhat lesser extent. He's reduced to basically a minion for Bill, and he understands how pathetic that is eventually and decides to commit himself to a more moral cause to actually help Mabel, the person he claims to care so much about, instead of simply feeding his ego. It's not a complete transformation or a complete rebuttal like what happens with Mabel at the end of the show, but it is a similar kind of revelation. And it's not coincidental, I think, that Gideon's revelation is placed right before Mabel's. These two characters are very similar, though Mabel is mostly kind and generous and heroic, and Gideon is possessive, cruel, and egotistical. They both have a lot of the same flaws. They are both deeply naive about their abilities to shape the world to their own images, to their own desires. They both fear a world that they cannot control, and they both react negatively when forced to confront their own limitations. The paralleling of these two characters is one of the more interesting and meaningful aspects of the show, and I think reflecting on it really demonstrates how elegantly structured and articulated the show really is. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos just like this one before anyone else. Keep watching Gravity Falls. There are a lot of complexities in this show, and I really appreciate how they can take a simplistic character like Gideon and add real pathos to him, and add enough depth to make his character actually matter in the grand scope of the show. Take care, everyone. Adios, comrades.